the process that I would take if I was starting a project to figure out if I should use React or where I should use React. So to figure out when anything should be used when it comes to technology, the place that we have to start with is, what is this technology good at? What is it good at solving? What kinds of problems does it solve really well? Where does it not solve things well? So we're going to break that down. What is React good at? So React, in my opinion, is really good at managing app-like web applications that have complicated front-end logic and state relationships. So I'm going to start with a counterexample. So recently, I built the new version of the website for this podcast, thereactshow.com, in React. It used to be just hosted on Squarespace. I rebuilt it in React. I've talked about this in a number of previous episodes. But something I realized I never talked about is the fact that it's probably not a good choice for React. So the reactshow.com, it's mostly for content. Like, you would go there, load a page, and you can see the title of the episode. You can hit a play button and listen to the episode. You can see some notes and the transcript, but it's not really an application. There's not much complicated business logic or front end anything. So sort of by default, just making a standard website with HTML and CSS, statically generated maybe or whatever, that would work. And not only would that work, but it would be simple. It would be easy to maintain. Like, I could probably just build it and let it run for a decade and not really have to do any maintenance on it. I don't need to upgrade React, don't need to deal with some new paradigm React comes out with, and I need to go back and update everything. And all my libraries have my JavaScript libraries have security vulnerabilities, and I got to deal with that all the time. I don't need to keep this infrastructure running. So purely for the sake of just showing content, obviously the reactshow.com shouldn't be written in React. I did it in React more because I wanted to experiment with some things, and I've talked about that in those episodes. But really, for the most part, I don't think I should have done it in React. But thinking about this, it also led to some hangups with that analysis. So one thing that I think is really cool about the new site is it has an audio player that spans multiple pages. So you can go to, say, the homepage, click play on an episode, and then go check out some other episodes while it's playing in the background. And this actually already starts to break down my whole idea of doing this all in HTML and CSS. How do you have sort of cross site or application state? So I'm navigating to different parts of my application, interacting with it, and I want to have some sort of state maintained in the background. The way that we used to do this was actually to use something called HTML frames. Essentially, it allows you to have multiple sort of independent websites on one web page, one website. And so I could have a frame that is my audio player, and then I could just have a regular HTML website with links and navigation for all the content. And that would work really well, except frames are deprecated and you're not supposed to use them. And theoretically, browsers could drop support for them at any time. One of those kind of annoying things. I think the idea is that iframes are supposed to replace them. And so I could go and make my audio player an iframe. And to be honest, this is probably what I should have done if I was approaching this project with, creating it so that it's the least expensive, most maintainable for the lowest price, which is kind of generally our goal with building software, right? So that would be what I should have done probably. Obviously, I chose to use React for other reasons. And so this, I think, started to highlight some more reasons when you might use React or what React is good for. So if if you can't do something with traditional web, traditional documents, that is an indication that maybe React is a good choice. But it's also not strictly an indication of that. It might actually not mean you need to use React. It just might mean you have some sort of single page application that uses some really lightweight JavaScript. The truth is, React is still like very heavyweight. So performance-wise, you can make React perform quite well enough. But when you look at its performance, including initial page load to the actual like running of the application, React is way, way more heavyweight than just plain HTML. It just doesn't even come close. You have to load an HTML document. You got to load all the JavaScript. And even if it's compiled and optimized and tree shaked, and you've done everything I said when it comes to profiling and using memo when you should and whatever, it's still not going to be as good of a user performance or a user experience as just a regular HTML website if that's what you could build it in. And I think a great way to explore this is if you try to use some heavy React websites on a slow internet connection with high latency, low bandwidth, which often does happen. It happens to me maybe not all the time, but not that infrequently on my phone. Like there's a lot of people around, so the network is just overloaded and not loading things very well. If you load a basic HTML website, it still works fairly well. Then I go try to load up some really big React website and it's a horrible, miserable experience. So the truth is it adds a lot of abstraction, it adds a lot of code. And so you don't want to use it unless you actually need to use it. I think in the industry right now, it's kind of like become the default way to make anything on the web. And that's absolutely not the approach you should take. When to use React in 2023? It's not all the time. It's absolutely not all the time. So you should use it if you have so much complicated client-side state and interactions and business logic with the DOM that the extra abstractions that React gives you makes up for the fact that React adds a lot of overhead. And this doesn't even, we didn't even touch on, I think, a huge piece of React overhead, which is maintenance and infrastructure. So React projects, there's just no way around it. You have to have bundlers and all sorts of stuff to optimize the code to make it production ready. It's harder to write tests for. It's you gotta, especially if you're looking at maybe the future of React, like I've said, with React server components. Oh, now you're running a Node server to run React and the front end, and it's a lot of extra overhead. You do not want to reach for that unless you actually need it. Unless you're gonna build something that if you tried to build it using traditional HTML and CSS and a little bit of random JavaScript here and there would be a nightmare. So the simple way that I look at it is, when should you use React in 2023? I would say first look and see if you can imagine building it using just HTML, CSS, and maybe some JavaScript here and there for some, interactions or whatever. But if you're like, yeah, that seems like I could imagine doing that, even if that means dynamically generating the HTML with Ruby on Rails or Java or whatever your backend is, that's fine. PHP, that works great. I would say if you can imagine doing it that way and you're not getting hung up on anything, that's a really good indication that you shouldn't be reaching for React. Generally, this will be on the internet, things like content. So if you're making a site for content, if you're just trying to show text or videos or whatever, in most cases, you probably don't want to reach for React. Even something like, say, YouTube, where or the Facebook feed or whatever, things like this where you're displaying content, even if you want it to be interactive, maybe React is the right choice, but I would bet it's not as clear cut. Like when it comes to displaying content, displaying documents, that kind of thing, my thinking would be you'd want to start not with React. So you just have regular HTML pages, and maybe for some complex parts, you would have React just controlling one small container within that page, one div, which you can totally do. You can have multiple of those on the same page too. So that would be my recommendation, is if you're like, okay, most of what I'm doing is showing content, letting people interact with content, create content. I would think you probably shouldn't use React as a single page application to control everything. You might use it to just have a few widgets within your page or whatever. But if you're trying to communicate things, React is probably not the thing you want to reach for first. It's only going to add complication, make it harder to optimize for search engines, harder to get good performance. I don't recommend it. But before we can completely answer this, I think we need to talk about SPAs in general. SPAs are single page applications. React is often used as a single page application. So to figure out when we should use React versus single page applications in general, we need to look at when is it good to use single page applications. So a single page application is, in my mind, it more of an application, more of an app. So I'm no longer, my goal is no longer just to display content per se. My goal might be, maybe it's a game or any, like an admin interface with complex business logic that just makes more sense to do on the front end. Where I want to have like if you imagine your application needing to have some sort of file menu, edit menu, a tools menu, all sorts of this type of thing, where maybe you need a history, you need a lot of state. To me, this is where a single page application makes sense, because your user interaction isn't based on navigating between content. So if your primary interactions are based more on lots of little bits of state here and there that combine with a bunch of logic to produce some output, then I'd say you're looking at a single page application. You're not looking at it as like, okay, people are going to just be navigating from this one thing to this next thing, and they want to be able to share these things easily. That would not be a good single page application. But, a text editor and, an IDE, a mail program, want to read my mail. A lot of these things are, I would say, make more sense as an application. So you'd look for a single page application. And really that just means, like, to make it more clear, single page application means you don't load a new document to navigate within your website. So the traditional way you develop web applications is you have an HTML document and you have links. You click that link, it fetches a new document, right? Single page application, you don't do that. You might still have, the URL might still change, but you do it via JavaScript, via the APIs JavaScript provides. And so when I look at it, I'm like, okay, React is, if you're using React for the entire experience, the entire website, like if somebody goes to your domain, they type in your domain, they go to your website, and you return a document that's essentially just one div, and that div is the root of React, and React renders inside of that, you're creating a single page application. You should only use React for that when everything you're doing, your entire site is just based around these complicated state management and logic that needs to be all connected together. Now, there's another way to use React, and this is something I don't see as often, but you can do what I've been trying to talk about, which is you can still have regular HTML documents that you build in the traditional way where you click a link, it fetches a new document, you go to the new page. But within that, you might have, let's say, a calendar component. And this calendar component is really complex and for some reason has a lot of logic and state that needs to be maintained. And just writing that in plain JavaScript could get out of hand to become spaghetti code. You can use React for just that component. In fact, this is, in my mind, a great argument for HTML5 web components. So what you could do is build this calendar component as an HTML5 web component that uses React internally. And in the future, you can swap it out with not using React or whatever you want. But in the development of your website, you just use this HTML5 component that maybe internally uses React for this complicated stuff, but it's not a single page application. It's just made for a component. So for React, I say, first you look at, hey, is this a single page application? Am I building a UI, an application? Sure, reach for React and use it for your entire site maybe. But another use case would be, I just have like some components within my site. Maybe my site in general is mostly content, like thereactshow.com. My podcast website is mostly content, but I also have this audio player and it's a bit complex. So maybe for this audio player, in fact, this is what I'm thinking about doing, is trying out making the whole website using traditional web technologies, but for the audio player, just for that, I use React. Because that's where things get complicated. That's where interactions with the DOM get complicated. That's where I actually have some state. So this is what I look at. This is the process I go through. Okay, React is good at single page applications, especially if you use something like Next.js, but it's also good at just managing state and connecting to the DOM in general. So if I'm creating components that I could just plop into my page, it could work well to just use React for each individual component. So this really, I think, rounds out the sort of high level of what I look at for when I should use React in a project. So in summary, I break down the features and I look at the features and I just try to think, or even maybe build a prototype where I try to do it using traditional web technologies, or maybe even some other technology. Maybe I'm like, maybe just a plain mobile application, like a native mobile application would be better. I try to think about, okay, could I do this in these other systems? What would that look like? Would that be really hacky and be really hard and not work well? Am I like, oh, wow, I've got these really complicated forms, and when the user types this into the form, I want to pop this up, and then I need to show this and have this interaction, and oh, wow, that's so much like logic, and I'm going to have to like update the DOM to show this new thing. And if I'm going into it and I'm seeing a lot of stuff like that, I'd be like, oh, okay, this might be a good use case for React. React is very good at this type of thing. But if I'm going into it and I'm like, yeah, okay, most of what I'm doing is displaying content. Most of what I'm doing does not have state or much state, and it's not very complicated logic, then probably I shouldn't build a single page application. I should just use regular old traditional web technologies. And if I run into specific like isolated parts of my website, components like the calendar component, or maybe even that specific form I was talking about, maybe 90% of your website is just showing content, but then you have one page with this complicated form with all this business logic. I'd be like, okay, that's where I should use React, but the rest of my website should be traditional web technologies. Or maybe I look at it and I'm like, oh, this would be way easier to build as a native mobile app, and I don't really need a website to start with, or whatever. Basically, when I'm looking though at it from a web perspective, if I am going to build a website, what I'm looking at is, how difficult would it be to build this using just regular traditional web technologies? And I would say if it seems doable and there's only maybe some parts that you might need React for, I would not use React as a single page application. I wouldn't use React to control everything. I would just use React for these specific use cases.